Okay, so hello everyone. I'm here with Blake. How's your last name pronounced? Junta?
Junta. Yeah.
Junta. Okay, nice. So he and we had a brief exchange on Facebook about some of my criticisms of the resurrection. Uh, and so, he left a long and I thought, pretty interesting response. But like, long Facebook text exchanges get annoying. So I just decided, it seems better to just have him here. So that's what we're doing. So just for the broader context, the basic idea is, I was addressing the minimal facts argument, where the basic idea is, look, there are all these historical facts that are well explained by the resurrection hypothesis, and the thought is that the alternative hypothesis, so there are facts agreed upon by historians. Jesus's tomb was found empty, though that one's a little bit more controversial. His skeptical brother James converted. Paul, who was a persecutor of the church, converted. Many of his disciples claimed to see him after his death, including in large groups. And so the thought is that, naturalists will have to, or at least a non-Christian will have to sort of tangle themselves in knots trying to explain away all this evidence, while a Christian has one simple, unified explanation, which is God raised Jesus from the dead, poof, explains all the facts. And my objection is, I think, while it sounds good, you can describe it as one event, God raised Jesus from the dead. Really, when you think of all the philosophical things that you're committed to as a result of that, it makes it so that it also requires a long host of implausible things happening. So I won't list all of them, but just to briefly describe, you have to think God exists. You have to think that he's in the business of intervening in the natural world, which I have certain reasons based on a theodicy that I've devised to think if there is a God, that he wouldn't want to intervene in the natural world, at least in this lifetime. You'd have to think that he sort of had some desire to intervene in first century Palestine, that he's this triune being with three persons, which is something of sort of doubtful coherence, that he had the desire to have a son. And so my thought is, this conjunction of claims is kind of implausible, especially when you read sort of like when you consider the strange things done by Jesus in the New Testament and the seeming moral abhorrence of the Old Testament, the strange doctrines on hell and so on. I think that if you're committed to all this, then the theory starts to look less good than a lot of the non-Christian explanations. So why am I wrong?
Well, that would be a bold way to put it, but yeah, I think there's a lot of room for pushback. I don't know. Where are you right now actually on the God exists question?
I'd say I'm around 50-50. So I think there are some good reasons to be a theist, some good reasons not to. But if it's 50%, it'll cut the probability. If a theory requires God exists, it'll cut the probability of that theory in half.
And for you, like the big weight pooler is evil. Like you put all these. I really liked your page on the case for theism. You brought a lot of good stuff together, but then it sounded like at the end you're like, but man, the problem of evil just like really weighs on me. And so is that kind of doing it for you, or is there a lot more than that, or?
Yeah, I think the problem of evil is a big part of it. The other significant bit is that I think theism requires being committed to a somewhat weird view of metaphysics in a lot of different areas, where the conjunctive probability of all the theistic claims is kind of low. So, for instance, just to take one example, for theism to be a plausible hypothesis, you'll have to think that theism is pretty simple. Okay, how do you make theism simple? Well, one way is you say, theism is what you get when you have a perfect being. You just have this one thing, perfection, or something that contains all the perfections or whatever. And the thought is that's supposed to be simple. And I'm not sure that perfection is a quality that carves reality at its joints. I'm not sure that, I think goodness carves reality at its joints, certainly, but I don't know if perfection does. I'm sort of inclined to like a certain to a kind of scalar utilitarian view, where I think that your reasons to do that, your reasons to do acts scale proportional to the consequences of the view. And if a person has a view like that, then it's a little bit hard to see the coherence of the notion of like having a perfect will, where you'll just think that, for every will in every circumstance, in some cases there will be an optimal will, where, there's a best thing to do, but in other cases there won't. So if there, so imagine a case where like you can write down any number.
Yeah, you don't have to get too detailed, but I hear what you're saying. Is basically the weird metaphysics, in particular, how do we get God to be simple? Um,
Yeah,
you know,
I think
yeah.
simplicity is simplicity is part of it, and then I think there are just some other bits that
Okay.
make it weird, especially if you're a Christian and you believe in this kind of Trinitarian metaphysics, which I
Okay.
find strange.
Well, I mean, if you're at 50-50 from the other evidence, then, that's probably not playing a gigantic role in your skepticism of um, the resurrection. It's probably some of these other things that are doing most of the work. Although the theism discussion is like super interesting to me, in particular the question of God's simplicity. So I'd love to chat about that, and a model that I'm attracted to that I think handles the simplicity stuff pretty well, and it doesn't take the perfection route. It actually tries to reduce perfection to something else. Um, but I mean, we can decide if we want to go there. But okay, then the other thing has to do with the business. You talked about the business of intervening. Is God in the business of intervening in the world? And here you think that that's improbable or implausible at least.
Yeah. So the thought behind why it's implausible that God would intervene in the world is, if you think that God is in the business of intervening in the world, then it's very hard to see why he doesn't perform many more interventions. Why he doesn't, for instance, prevent the Holocaust or prevent COVID from developing, however whatever one thinks its origins are. So here's a plausible theological story that I think is by far the most plausible theological story, where you say God wants to basically put us in a world as it would look like in the absence of God. Now he still provides the necessary furnishings for agents. So
Mm-hmm.
he provides things like fine tuning and psychophysical harmony. Given that if we were just the psychophysical mess, then there would be no possibility of any conscious thought. But then beyond that, he does not intervene in the world, at least until the afterlife. Why would he do that? Well, he might have reasons for doing this that we don't know about. It might be that, just as, for instance, you might strengthen your relationship with your spouse by sort of taking a little vacation, so that they sort of see, oh, life is so much worse in the absence of this person.
Yeah.
God might do a similar thing, and I think this is the only plausible theological explanation, or at least something along these lines, because there's just so much evil in the world that is naturally predicted by the hypothesis of indifference.
Right.
And so I think, unless you think that theism gets to kind of co-opt the hypothesis of indifference, which this theodicy does, at least in this earthly life, then I think theism starts to look like a really bad theory. So, for instance, it's very hard to see, if you think that there's some theological story like soul building, that explains evil, it's very hard to see why the optimal degree of pleasure and pain distribution is the one provided to us by evolution. It
Mm-hmm.
seems very unlikely that evolution, this sort of naturalistic and different process, would produce the optimal amount of pleasure and pain for soul building.
Yeah, that's very fair. And yeah, it does seem like that sort of indifference. Oh, he wants it to look like he's not there, can come off as pretty ad hoc. So I can see that carrying some weight. Um, yeah, I mean, it's possible, as you say. But it's not the most natural thing you'd want to resort to. Okay, and then the next one is that he had some desire to do this stuff like in Palestine around this time, kind of thing.
Um, yeah, right. And the thought there is that, um, like, uh, well, um, just any theory that commits you to some specific event, that'll reduce its probability somewhat. It
Yeah,
commits you to
it's got to happen at one time or another, sort of
yeah,
thing.
yeah, right. It does have to happen. Yeah, yeah, okay. Yeah, I guess yeah, I was thinking a little bit more about this, and I think maybe this one isn't a good objection, because just like whatever time he does, uh
There's going to be
he'll have to pick a
improbabilities
time.
associated with
And
it.
so yeah, maybe this is I feel like this is the kind of erroneous reasoning that this might be the kind of erroneous reasoning that is involved when people accuse the fine-tuning argument of being the inverse gambler's fallacy, where
Mm.
like, but yeah, sorry, yeah, that's a tangent. So scratch this one from the record.
Okay, we got okay. Then the third one is it seems like if you accept the resurrection, then all of a sudden you've got to accept the Trinity, and the wider Christian story, at least the essential parts of it.
Yeah.
Um, and like I do think that the case ultimately for those other parts are good. and I'd want to, convince you of them. But as a first step, I don't know if we need to dive into that right away. Why? Well, because you could kind of enter into it thinking, look, the Bible's really errant. I don't have to believe that, Jesus or the early Christians taught the Trinity. I can get away with that well enough. And there are maneuvers you can make if you don't put too much faith in the biblical text, and so that might be a one that we can sort of um, that may not have to carry a lot of weight if sort of your entering phase would be a more a liberal form of belief in Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the thought is like you sort of have a reason to believe in the resurrection, and then from the resurrection, you'll once you believe that there was some supernatural force that resurrected Jesus, then you'll sort of do inference to the best explanation about that. I mean, the problem there is I just think that in terms of how good of an explanation the resurrection is, on whether there's a plausible story about why and if kind of the best game in town about why the resurrection would occur commits you to all these implausible additional assumptions, then it starts to look like not a very good theory. I mean, so imagine
Yeah,
that I was,
I agree. I agree. Yeah,
yeah, like it would be
so
like if you were trying to argue that Muhammad split the moon, and you were like, okay, let's set all the implausibility of Islam aside, and let's just look at the historical evidence for his splitting the moon. Well, no, you look at all the reasons why Islam.
Well, it's more what you said a second ago. Is if I'm gonna like take advantage of some of these other theological elements that make the story plausible, then I can't just turn around and deny that or say, oh, you don't have to accept those theological elements later.
Right.
No, it's you got to go one direction or the other. But I don't think I'll be taking advantage of the doctrine of the Trinity, or as you put it, God's desire to have a son. I'd phrase that differently or anything like that. So I don't know. I don't think I'll be committing that sort of mistake. I think we can. So like my proposal is just what we're doing is model building, and I want to see if I can come up with a model that maybe you'll find more appealing and easier to kind of slip into, and that model doesn't involve the Trinity. So that's all.
Okay.
Does that make
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I guess if you think like that Christianity could be plausible without the Trinity, or maybe you also think the Trinity is plausible once you're a Christian, but worst case scenario, I become like a Dale Tuggy style Unitarian Universalist or something.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So then I guess the Trinity is maybe not an explicit commitment that would be as required, or maybe we could. Maybe there are like some heretical views of the Trinity that make sense or something.
When we can talk about the Trinity too, I'm happy to. I'm just trying to like focus on the most important.
Yeah. No, I know it's a lot, which is it is sort of unfortunate. But when you're comparing these kind of broad world views, there are going to be a lot of considerations. But but I think with other stuff like the other thing, in order for God raising Jesus from the dead to be a plausible explanation, like I think you'll have to think it's probably not especially ad hoc. You'll have to think, Jesus was the Son of God, probably, or like at least had this very high messianic status and was following in the footsteps of the God of the Old Testament. And so I think you are still going to have trouble. Basically, whatever your explanation is, I think there's not going to be a remotely plausible explanation of the kind of the stuff in the New Testament that of raising Jesus from the dead that doesn't raise the kind of like concerns about the like violence and
I would put it this way. I would say we better come up with a reason to think that God raising, of all the miracles to do and all the ways to do it, like this particular miracle, we shouldn't think it's particularly implausible that of all the things that God would do, that God would raise Jesus from the dead. We can't think that that's like prohibitively implausible. And so there needs to be some kind of story that helps make that more plausible. Because otherwise it's going to be too, out there. If it's going to be a lot more like someone tells me that they just saw their neighbor flying in circles, around their house, shooting fireballs, right? I mean, it's going to come off like that if you don't have a story for why raising Jesus is the kind of thing that God might plausibly do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I agree. You'll have to have a view on which, yeah, there's sort of a plausible story about why he would, why that would be the miracle he would do.
Yeah. And then that's where you might start thinking about some of those theological elements, because you're thinking, well, I sort of get to that, they're making the resurrection plausible. I was thinking I got there through some of these other elements having to do with Jesus being the Son and whatnot. I might take a different route though to get to that same, the actual part that counts, which is making the resurrection not, super implausible from a God's eye view. Okay, so let's set aside the God exists question for now. Although if we have time, let's return to it, because there's some stuff I want to say there, and some of this other things. The main ones that we should think about are I want to talk about like your argument. You have an argument that seems to carry a lot of weight for you about God's intervening, and you're thinking, well, if God was in the business of intervening, and then I would sooner expect him to be like preventing evil. So it's actually connected a lot to the God exists question.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe we'll get to talk about it after all. Um, so there are a lot of theodicies, and I think I've written an article or a page. I don't know if you've seen it on Belief Map. I linked to it in our Facebook conversation, where I go through like 12 of these theodicies that I think carry significant weight. And the intro to the whole list of theodicies is me saying what these aren't supposed to do. Like, I'm not claiming these are the reasons. I'm not claiming they're all the reasons. Um, these are just the kinds of reasons that, could, I think the title was, things that, would like risk or require, pain or, some suffering to some degree. Um, and my whole goal in that particular page was to say that rational people can survey this list of theodicies and come away not being very confident that God would prevent more evil than he already has. Because we don't know if God is preventing some measure of evil. We're not sure. But it seems, kind of like from the perspective of epistemic humility, it gets really difficult to say, oh, God would definitely be preventing more evil. From my perspective, given this list of theodicies. And so, like, one that carries a lot of weight for me that I mentioned in our chat is this one from Peter Van Inwagen. I think he spells it out really good in his paper on like the magnitude and such of evil. I might pull up the quote if I can get it quickly enough. But basically, the gist is that if God exists, and given kind of the common claim, which we can discuss the plausibility of, that God wants people to freely turn to Him, um, it doesn't seem like it becomes so implausible that he would allow the disconnection of him from creation to result in people realizing that this isn't the best state. Like for people, the way Peter Van Inwagen puts it is people should be able to discover on their own through being able to self-order their own lives and govern themselves, and see what the world is like without God. That should allow them to decide that and realize that this is not a good world. We have been separated from God. This is not how things are supposed to be. And if God just came in and like fixed everything, then in putting sort of a band-aid on that situation would prevent them from achieving the very realization that would result in them getting their highest good and frankly the purpose for which they were created. Have you thought much about like a model like that, or what do you think about
Yeah,
that?
yeah. So I do like Van Inwagen's theodicy, and actually, my theodicy. I mentioned, the kind of hypothesis of indifference theodicy. I mentioned that to Dustin Crummett, and he was like, "That sounds a lot like Van Inwagen's." And
No,
so,
yeah.
yeah, and I think, I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, a few problems with it. The first one is, as even Van Inwagen admits, this particular theodicy does not explain animal suffering.
Yeah.
Um, where he thinks that there's a totally different explanation of animal suffering. Yet I think
Mhm,
his explanation of animal suffering is completely ridiculous and not at all
mhm,
convincing. Where his explanation of animal suffering is, look, the only way to get worlds where you have uh, the only way to get creatures like us without in what he calls a non-massively irregular world, where he's like, where God, a world's massively irregular if there are like huge violations of the laws of nature. He says the only way to do this is through having, some process like evolution by natural selection, and that will require a lot of animal suffering and death.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, and just not being a massively irregular world is just this vast axiological value that's worth like all the suffering. It's like, what?
Mm-hmm.
I don't even have I don't have the intuition that it's a value at all. That like
Mm-hmm.
how much, set all else equal, just how interventionist God is in the world has anything to do with has any axiological status by itself. And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't think it's a plausible explanation of animal suffering. The other point is like the most forceful version of the problem of evil, I think, is the one that notes that it's not so much that there's just lots of stuff that goes wrong in the world. It's that there's lots of stuff that goes wrong in ways that seem produced by blind and infrequent processes like evolution. So, as I said before, okay, what are the odds that that God would, that the optimal degree of pleasure and pain for whatever God's ultimate purposes are would be that produced by evolution. Now, Van Inwagen's theodicy has the advantage of saying, well, but God wants to not intervene in the world. He wants to put us in a world that actually, is pretty shitty, so we freely turn away from him. But I think with Van Inwagen's theodicy, there's going to be kind of a dilemma where the more you bank on the possibility, on the fact that God wants to put us in a genuinely bad world, where
Or not put us in a genuinely bad world, but allow us to live in a world that has evil. I mean, his whole idea was that the earth, God put in sort of the Garden of Eden state, whether you take that literally or not. God was providing a certain level of protection. So God created a nomically regular world, a scientifically elegant, discoverable world, which I see some value in that. And I think a lot of scientists do. It's part of what draws people into science. But the idea is he created that. And there was, a planet, of course, that, in the midst of this design that allowed humans to flourish, but it also did involve his intervention to some degree. My suspicion is that God created humans such that if damage was done to their body, they were killed, they would just be resurrected right away. And that ties actually to what goes on with Jesus. I think that Jesus is sort of the natural state of humans when they're in relationship with God. I think that they return to life. I think that God's intention for creating humans as resemblers, as entities bearing his image of him, I think that we were never intended to die. That is something that came about as a result of sin. Um, so I think that there were factors in place that mitigated, sin and destruction of the body in that earlier state. That's what was removed when relationship with God was removed.
yeah, the worry is it's hard to see why God would, like, if the idea is like we're a lot, we lay our bed and then God lets us sit in it, to use the
Mhm.
expression,
Right, exactly. That's a
then
good way to put it.
it's hard to see why God would intervene, like how it makes sense, how that theodicy makes sense of God intervening in the world. So the puzzle is, if you think that, like, I think there's a consistent theodicy like Van Inwagen's theodicy where you just say, yeah, God allows us to exist apart from him. And he doesn't intervene. He allows us to be in the world like this, and then in the
Mhm.
afterlife, he'll sort of like try to establish a relationship with us because that's of great value. That seems like a perfectly coherent and perfect and convincing picture, but that picture is broadly incompatible with something with the Christian story where God intervenes in the world. So you have to
Yeah.
think that God is in the business of sometimes intervening in the world, but very rarely. And then, but if he's doing that, it becomes hard to see why. What the reasons are that make it so that he can intervene, but only fairly rarely, and not in particularly flashy ways. And he
Here's
doesn't.
my suggestion. Here's my suggestion for it, is God's ultimately getting to the goal. So on my model, and this comes right out of my model of God, which we can talk about. What God is doing is he's creating a world that resembles himself. Now, God is not himself a world. So, there's some thinking to do about what resemblance looks like between two categorically very different things, an entity, God, and a world. How do you create resemblance? Um, but anyways, I think that is ultimately what's happening. I think God is the foundation of reality. My model basically treats God as what I call the modal deadlock resolver. So I think you have a bunch of, possible worlds. I think that's the initial state um, of reality, so to speak, and one of those has to obtain. And you have to come up with a way to deal with how one of those obtains over the others. My model says that God is just the thing that's required to get to single out and get to one particular world over the others. But there's a lot more particulars because it focuses on beginnings in particular, maximal initial states. How do you get the initial maximal states? So I say there's at least one initial maximal state. There's at most one initial maximal state. But the problem is there's a lot of possible initial maximal states. And I think you ultimately need a foundational entity, which is just the segment of reality that's the necessary stuff, all the Platonic stuff and whatnot. I think that happens to be conscious, and I think that that's the very thing that has to be the deadlock resolver. So we can get into that, but the principle that I add to that is that what it resolves to, and I build this out of the standard analysis of counterfactuals of what would happen, basically is something that is similar to possible as that necessary segment itself. I know that went way too fast, but that's just a long way of me, or a short way of me saying that I predict on my model of theism that the world is going to resemble God as much as possible, or it's going to be one of the worlds that resembles the foundational state as much as possible. And anyway, so why is that relevant to what we're talking about? Because I think that part of what makes the world resemble God is having a bunch of God-like entities in it, namely you and me. In terms of being conscious beings, we have power, we have knowledge. It's just we have these sort of limited forms of it. But even that on my model is going to be exacerbated when, in the heavenly state. But God is also going to destroy entities that ultimately are not going to choose to resemble him. So, and this comes to like what I understand the gospel to be is God created us with the intention of us being God resemblers. That's, we're supposed to be echoing God throughout reality. But insofar as God is free, we are also free. And if God's going to respect that freedom, we have to freely choose to sort of give our free will to God. Like basically, I think the grand intention or purpose of you being here on earth right now is to make the ultimate decision about whether you're going to turn your steering wheel over to God. And what God has the capacity to do with the indwelling of the Spirit through that mechanism is to basically prevent you from sinning. If you're ever going to steer into a wreck or do something that disresembles God, evil, God just prevents you from doing that. Now, but here's the catch: is God isn't just going to impose himself on doing that, because if he takes away your free will without your consent, there's a sense in which you're no longer a God resembler anymore. You making this a free choice is part of what is part of what gives you the value that God is seeking in producing the world as it is. Okay, so why is that relevant? Because again, I do think that all evil is going to be destroyed. There are going to be some people who have chosen, who have not made the choice to submit their free will to God. And God's going to go through, I think that God is tolerating sin right now, all of this disresemblance, because it's securing a greater resemblance through people who freely choose him. But there is going to be a point where God's just going to destroy all disresemblance. And that includes anybody who is going to, not submit their will, because otherwise if God just eliminated all pain and suffering right now, you would still have evil people around who haven't submitted to God, who will continue to do selfish, disresembling things, and that's exactly the thing that God's not going to tolerate for much longer.
Wait, so
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not clear on why this makes it so that God intervenes sometimes in the world in terms of sending his son, sending the son, and making him become incarnate and intervening, etc.
Yeah, I was just getting there.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry.
Yeah. So, but I mean, so everything that's happening in the biblical story is to feed into that goal of securing people freely choosing him. Okay. So when God is performing miracles, I don't think it's like, oh, God's trying to make the world a better place. Otherwise, you would like directly. Otherwise, you would expect him to stop holocausts and whatnot. That's not his intention. He will destroy evil. It will be gone. But right now, what God is doing is he's securing the thing that makes the world good, which is free agents that have submitted their will to him. So when you look at the miracles that lead up to the Messiah and to Jesus Christ, these are the kind of miracles that result in, for instance, in the case of Jesus, vindicating to you and me that, like, hey, guess what? God preserves the righteous. That's a constant Old Testament theme mentioned in the New Testament as well, that God will destroy the wicked and preserve the righteous. Well, if you're performing miracles that where Jesus, being the only righteous, sinless person, dies and he brings him back to life, well, that just reiterates the very message that God's been telling you, that the righteous will live on. He will preserve them. So those are the miracles I think you'll expect, and other miracles that like sort of vindicate the credibility of the general Jewish story. I think we should be open to those as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so okay. I mean, a few worries. One of them is that uh well, okay, so yeah, so I mean, so the first worry is that it is, if you think that God is in the business of doing miracles, the world's an unpredictable place. There's sort of this vast butterfly effect. So I think, for any given miracle that he might perform, like suppose God performed a random miracle, which is just levitating my computer by 10 feet and then bringing it back down.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how that would contribute to salvation, increase
Exactly.
or decrease it. But, I'd expect about 50% of acts like that to contribute positively to salvation.
Mm-hmm.
For the following reason. Every time any act happens that has any significant effect on the world, or even relatively insignificant effect on the world, that will, change the time, delay people by a few seconds, which will change the time of their procreative acts. And as a result, it will totally change the identity of future people, which means that even very innocuous acts like that would, change the identity or not millions, a few centuries down the line of every single person in the world. Given
Mm-hmm.
that, even these seemingly innocuous acts have really dramatic effects on the world overall. And so if that's true, then you'd expect, okay, if God is willing to perform a miracle, if and only if it contributes positively to salvation, well, you just expect him to be performing like tons and tons of miracles constantly. And that's not what we observe. And you would especially expect him to perform like various extremely convincing vindicatory miracles. So like, he could have made the resurrection evidence much better. He could have made it so that, Jesus then appeared to the Romans and wrote down stuff. And then he, flew around and left, a photograph in the sky that has laid there to this day of him ascending into the heaven that no one has been able to get rid of. There are lots of ways that he could have made it more convincing. And so it's very implausible that that the specific natural laws that exist in the world are such that basically the optimal way of achieving salvation is to virtually never intervene in order to prevent in order to change them. That there's virtually never a case where changing them positively contributes to salvation.
Okay, so here's a famous challenge to the idea that God might be performing lots of miracles, especially these sort of random miracles. Imagine we did live in a world where there were just random miracles of random things happening all the time, and then Jesus rose from the dead. You would have just destroyed any case for the resurrection, because guess what? Random stuff happens sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's an interesting point. But I think, so you could have all these like sort of small scale miracles, but then you could have this really big resurrection miracle where, like, in the very grandiose ways I described, where just the ascension of Jesus, a picture of it becomes emblazoned on the sky, such that anywhere in the world you look up and you see that just as certain people have these transformative religious experiences where they feel like they've, come into contact with the divine. Everyone could have this about Jesus. They could just sort of know instinctually that Christ is king, and so on.
Yeah. Okay.
And
So, go ahead.
sorry, just very briefly, I
Yeah.
think that like if you just ask, okay, imagine God was maximizing the number of people who were becoming saved, and like the idea is, and you become saved, maybe not just through being a Christian in this life, but that's at least sort of like a big, the main path to it, and maybe that is the only way. It'll depend on certain theological commitments. I think you would expect a world much more like this, and much less like the one we see in the actual world, where there's virtually no deviation from the gnomic regularities. Sorry,
Can you say that again? For some reason you said it, and maybe it's because I was thinking in my head of other stuff, which I know is a bad practice, but for whatever reason it didn't register. Can you repeat that?
Oh yeah. So the thought is that, just imagine, prior to looking at the world, you're like, okay, God's trying to maximize the amount of salvation in it. He's trying to get as many people to freely choose him as possible. You're like, okay, what world would we expect? I think we would expect a world very different from this one. We would expect a world where like huge numbers of things are happening in it that end up contributing to salvation. Nearly everyone has these very powerful transformative experiences where they feel the presence of Jesus directly, and they sort of feel like, they feel his presence instinctually, and from that moment on they kind of know that they should follow in Jesus's path. Whether they in fact choose to follow him is a separate question. I think you'd expect a world much more like that one, and much less like the one we actually have. And in particular, it's very surprising that it would be a very big surprise if the world that was optimal for the purposes of salvation would involve basically like just total adherence to these gnomic laws that govern everything. Would involve evolution by natural selection. It just seems like the hypothesis of indifference predicts. I think there are certain facts that it doesn't predict very well, like it doesn't predict the fine tuning of the constants, etc. But sort of once you have the basic things that result in the universe, and that result in agents like us, then I think the hypothesis of indifference is a much better explanation, in that it provides this really natural explanation of nearly all the facts about evil, which is why I think my theodicy is good, allows us to co-opt it, and the alternative is not.
Got it. Okay. So like I still think there's a lot to talk here. I want to hit two major things, but I do want to say quickly, like we would need to modify that sort of initial idea of just random miracles happening all the time that seem to have no significance at all. Because if you do that, then the resurrection of Jesus would carry no significance. And the resurrection of Jesus was in part supposed to be a sign. And so
you could have the resurrection be even more grandiose than those other, like the normal miracles are sort of mundane, but the resurrection is this really big grandiose miracle where everyone knows about it all over the world, like picture of it happening emblazoned on the sky. Like surely there would be a way, even if miracles were mundane, for this to happen. Like in the Narnia books, for instance, magic is mundane, but nonetheless Aslan has ways of revealing himself, where like he can be especially significant.
Yeah.
Relative to
okay, so then as I'm thinking about the ordering of things, maybe this is the one to start with. So I there's a scripture that says that God desires for all to be saved, and I believe that. But as a lot of Calvinists point out, you can desire something, but that doesn't mean you don't have competing desires. You can have desires in conflict. So, you can have this desire for all to be saved, but if, the Old Testament's any indicator, in parts of the New Testament as well, there's also a desire for God to destroy evil. And insofar as we are evil, there is a real desire for God to destroy the wicked. And so as I try to think about what a perfect being is like, even if, we don't like to think about it, as I contemplate the notion of perfection, the concept of holiness and the desire to destroy evil has to be there. I think God should have both sort of this emotional, strong, unsurpassable desire to both save the sinner and also to destroy the sinner. And anything less than both of those, you would have a less than perfect God. Before moving on, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't find that plausible just on independent philosophical grounds, because I don't believe in desert. But that would be kind of its own can of worms. My argument against desert is very complicated.
Okay.
But I wrote a paper on it.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about plausibility, then There are a lot of smart people who do believe in dessert. Um,
Yeah.
hope
Yeah.
maybe would you be epistemically humble enough to be open to the idea that maybe dessert is a real factor, like a lot of people think it is?
Yeah, I mean, so
Um,
I think one's credence that there is such thing as dessert should be at least reasonable. But even if you do believe in dessert, I think that this is a very implausible picture of dessert, where basically, like, the view held by nearly all non-Christians around the world is that, um, okay, maybe, we're far from perfect, but we're at least good enough that we don't deserve to like suffer or be destroyed. Where when you just a typical human is destroyed, that's quite a bad thing. They're not getting what they rightfully deserve. Uh, I think if you believe in dessert, I'm sort of more sympathetic to accounts wherein like basically dessert determines how good it is when you get good stuff. So if a person's really deserving when they get good stuff, that's better than if a person's really bad. But no one deserves to suffer. Um,
okay, actually, let's make this easier. Let's drop dessert. We don't need dessert. All we need is the destruction of evil.
oh,
So if God is holy, to what degree would God want to destroy evil? And I'm ultimately leaning into annihilationism here. I'll talk about that in a second. Maybe that's why you were thinking about something else. But suppose that let's get rid of dessert. Let's just say God is holy, God is perfect. To what degree would God want to destroy evil immediately?
well, I think you'd want to destroy. So I think you would want to destroy evil to some degree. Uh, well, so I mean, again, I'm not. I actually think that I'm sort of a utilitarian. I kind of think that the people having a bad character is instrumentally bad, of course, but like I don't think it's intrinsically bad. But I'm not super confident in that view. Epistemic humility and so on. But I don't think what I don't think is plausible is that humans are like bad enough for it to for God to want to destroy us overall. So you might have
But let me. No, I don't want to ask about overall at the moment. Because what I want to suggest is that you can have competing desires, and I do want to like secure, and I feel like you can, if you think about it, you can agree with me that there is a desire. The more holy God is, the more perfect God is, the more God will have a desire to destroy sin, evil immediately. And if God lacks that desire to any degree, any speck, he is a less than perfect God. Now, that doesn't mean that that's his overall decision to do, but if we deny that desire, then I think we're getting a less than perfect God. What do you think about that hypothesis?
I think it would. So I agree that all else equal, one should have a desire. A perfect God would have a desire to destroy evil, but I think like it might be that that even though you have a desire to destroy, a perfect God has a desire to destroy evil. Destroying the person does not sort of fulfill the like destruction of evil in the right way. So imagine someone dies and you're like, well, at least there's an upside. All the evil in them is destroyed. That doesn't seem like a fitting attitude to have. It doesn't seem like the fitting attitude that a perfect being would have. Where even if you think that there is some reason to destroy for evil to be destroyed, where like if a person has some bad character trait, then it would be good if they stopped having that character trait. Uh, it's not plausible that like it would be good if they were destroyed, that their evil counts in favor of destroying them just to get rid of that character trait.
So, what are you going to do if I come back and I say, well, then, okay, my picture of God is is holier, at least in one aspect. He obviously has at least a slightly stronger degree to destroy evil than yours does.
Um, well, but I think you have to be clear on what we're talking about when we're talking about destroying evil. So,
And
you want
before you like put too much weight into trying to defend what you're saying, I'm not talking about what God's ultimate decision will be. Like when we in the morning, you have a desire to get out of bed and a desire to stay in bed. That doesn't mean you're going to choose to stay in bed or whatever. So when I'm
yeah, right.
asking you to,
I'm not talking about the I'm not talking about the like all things considered desire because I agree what you're saying doesn't commit you to the all things considered desire, but
yeah,
my
okay,
thought is just that like you might have a desire to like you might have some desire for X, but then if X is achieved in way Y, then it doesn't fill your desire uh, for X to happen, right? So, imagine my brother's annoying me. And so I have a desire for my brother to stop annoying me. And it turns out that the way that my brother stops annoying me is someone just kills him. You know, I, it's not like, well, there, at least your desire for him to stop annoying you is fulfilled, but it's just outweighed by this other desire. It's like, I don't even know, like, I mean, well, actually, maybe in that case it would count in favor of it a little bit. But like, obviously outweighed. But it's like there are cases where you have a desire for X and Y achieves X, but you don't have even a pro tanto desire for Y, even based on it achieving X. And so the thought is that might
So
be the case
let's go with the brother illustration. I mean, I don't think you're taking it to the maximal degree yet. I mean, I'm not talking about killing, but you desire his annihilation or the annihilation of the source of that. You desire the annihilation most directly of, the annoyance. So there's, I mean, technically, like, oh, I can annihilate the sound waves and blah, blah, blah. But setting that aside, assume that those aren't options. You actually would desire, if it was maximal, if you were maximally annoyed, unsurpassably, then I think you would desire that annihilation if there were no other immediate solutions.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree,
Immediate
but I
is
mean, so
easier too.
here's another case that illustrates the principle.
Okay.
I'm enjoying this chat. I desire to continue this chat. It's a good chat, which means that I desire the conjunct. I desire that we continue the chat, or that some faraway planet zigs in a way that it's not going to zig. But if the chat stopped and the faraway planet zigged in that way, even though my desire would technically be fulfilled, I would not, like, that conjunctive desire would be fulfilled.
Uh-huh.
I still wouldn't. I would have no. There wouldn't even be a pro tanto thing counting in favor of that state of affairs.
You lost me there.
Oh, so the idea is, okay, suppose you have a desire for A. That implies that you have a desire for A or B.
Right.
And then
Yep.
suppose B happens. It's true that you have a desire for A or B, and B happening entails A or B happens.
Yep.
But if your ultimate desire is for A, then B happening, that isn't, you don't even have any pro tanto desire for B to happen, even though it fulfills a desire that you have, because it's not fulfilling it in the right way. And the thought is the destruction of evil. You might want, like, God might have a desire for the destruction of evil, but only if it's destroyed in the right way. So if the way that evil is destroyed is a guy who's mostly pretty good but has some negative character traits, gets annihilated forever, then I think maybe that wouldn't even be a that might not even be a pro tanto reason, where, like, for the similar reason that I described in the case I gave. Though I don't know. These cases are getting, it's getting a little bit tricky to give the principle. But I'd be happy to just grant, like, okay, it's plausible God wants to destroy evil.
Yeah. In my thinking, to the extent that God is perfect, whatever other desire God may have, God will have an unsurpassable desire to immediately destroy evil. And for me, that like fits nicely with a lot of the texts in scripture that talk about God displaying patience with humanity and not destroying humanity, because God wants a world that does not even have a spot of disresemblance to him, or at least beyond what's necessary, among those competing options. So God really is itching to destroy evil as we speak. And God could not desire it more than he already does. But guess what? God also, we happen to be major God resemblers, in large part because of our capacity for freedom. And I think that as a result, God has a desire to save us at the same time. We are the very thing that God values. That's our purpose, is to resemble God. And so there's this torn decision in my model that God's making. And the ultimate takeaway is, whether, if God destroyed everyone, God is good. If God just immediately destroyed everyone right now, annihilated everyone, God is good. because all of us are evil and it's compatible with that perfect nature. If God desired to find a way to save everybody and he just continued to be patient, um, assuming that everybody ultimately would freely choose him, which I find very unlikely, but let's say, as some universalists hope that it would, then that also is compatible with God's perfect nature. Or if God chose some middle ground road where a lot of people are justly, not to an unjust degree, but justly annihilated as a result of their sin. Although that might bring desserts in, so I don't need to do that right now. But will destroy some and then preserve others, preserve those who choose to submit their will to Him. In which case they'll never sin again. So the idea is that God cleanses them of the sin that they performed, and then removes evil so that they never sin again, and then preserves them. That middle ground solution is also perfectly compatible with God's freedom. And that torn decision is just one of these instances where God's free will is expressed. And there's different worlds where he does it differently. But I don't see any incoherence in the idea that this is how God does it in this world. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. My conception of a perfectly morally good being is like one who's perfectly morally responsive to reasons, to moral reasons, where, if they have, they do what they have most moral reason to do. So if whatever the best act is, they perform it, they have all the right sets of dispositions, etc. And I think, if you have a view like that, then you should think that God, while he has a very strong desire to eradicate evil, he has a stronger desire to, not eradicate people who are, on the whole, they have a lot of good in them. They, perform various just acts. They sort of have the capacity to have all these welfare goods. I think it would be wrong for God to destroy such beings for the same reason that it would be wrong for a human to destroy another person, which is that, it's bad when a person is destroyed. You shouldn't bring about bad things. So you shouldn't destroy a person.
Where are you getting the value of persons and stuff, or where are these values coming from, are you thinking?
Well, I don't think values really have a source. I think, I'm sort of a moral Platonist, where I think, they're just as there are certain mathematical and modal facts that exist without any further source, there are also certain value facts that exist without any further source.
Yeah. So on my model, there is no fundamental good and evil. Good and evil are what we call the things that happen to resemble and disresemble the foundation of reality. So for me, it all reduces to the question of resemblance. So
So
I have, sorry.
when you say God is good, is that anything more than a tautology? Is that anything more than saying God is godlike?
Um, let's see if I remember how I respond to this, because this is I haven't done a I used to be like a full-time apologist, doing this stuff. I've since been doing other things. No, it's not a tautology. Um, the reason being, um, I think when we're like, this gets into like the semantics of good. So when we say what we mean by good, um, I think that we're talking about like being loving, being honest, or the kinds of things that are loving and honest, and beautiful and whatnot. Um, so I am saying that God is loving and beautiful and all that. That's like what I'm meaning, when I say that God is good. I'm not saying that God is God. I'm saying that God is loving and all that stuff. It just so happens that I reduce those things. I think that they all reduce ultimately. I'm not talking about the meaning, but I'm saying that they reduce to God resemblance.
Okay, and so suppose the foundation of reality were like spiteful and wicked. Would it be good to be spiteful and wicked?
I don't know that that's possible, because I'm positing on my model there's this necessary principle that the necessary segment of reality that's responsible for deadlock resolving to some contingent, world that unsurpassably resembles it. in terms of resemblance, those sort of properties involved, they can't be other than what they are. So if we have this sort of like, um, so like if it is resemblance itself, like resemblance has a lot of relationship here to like almost love, where if God is trying to produce, if the foundation is producing foundation like things, and we're one of those foundation like things, then trivially that's going to amount to, you know, basically making it first off having a foundation like thing, and then making it more and more foundation like. In other words, the more power you give it, the more knowledge you give it, the more it's going to be foundation like. And that's trivially like, you can't change that. So it comes out of this, so out of the necessary principles, I don't think it could be what we call evil.
Yeah, well, so I think it may be metaphysically impossible for it to be evil, but there are certain things that are metaphysically possible, but you can still coherently think of in terms of thought experiments. So, for
Mhm.
instance, presumably you think that atheism is metaphysically impossible if you think that God is a necessary being, but nonetheless, you can make claims like, if atheism were true, such and such would be unlikely. And so,
Yeah.
if you can make claims about what would follow from some metaphysically impossible worldview, I think you could do the same thing here.
Yeah, but I can say that it becomes very implausible. I do think it's so. For instance, I'm not absolutely certain of the principles that I'm suggesting are necessary, but I do find them significantly more plausible than their negation, just considering them abstractly, a priori. Um,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah, well, so I mean, the other problem I think for grounding goodness in God is okay. Well, so here's a principle: explanation can't go in a circle, so it can't be that A explains B and B explains A.
Hmm.
And so, if that's true, if you think that God explains the good, then the good can't explain God, and so then you don't have any explanation of why God is loving or uh, caring, or that he values
Well, I just
various.
gave an explanation, that resemblance explanation I gave. Now, again, this is not like some widespread model of God, but on the model of God I have, I think it is explained.
Yeah, maybe I didn't understand the explanation.
Yeah, that's, and
Um,
I don't expect you to. That's not your fault. It's a challenge with articulating a model that quickly. But on my model, basically you have two segments of reality. Any possible world has two segments: the necessary segment and the contingent segment.
mhm.
Okay. The necessary segment, I presume, to include these things that we have arguments for, kind of this Platonic realm. I really think that there are numbers. I really think that there are shapes,
I agree.
and I think that these are sort of networked in a brain-like way. I think that that is the mind. I think that basically you have this abstract construct of all this stuff together. Um, I just also happen to think that this is also the thing that provides a solution to the modal deadlock problem that I described earlier. I'm not sure if you caught what exactly that was, but
Yeah,
basically,
that's something to do with how you get one world rather than another, but I
yeah,
didn't.
yeah. I mean, I can. So basically, it goes like this. I would give three premises to start it off. I'm going to use the word beginning to as a short for an initial maximal state, and you know what I mean by a maximal state, right?
It's
Like a
just like
world.
like a maximally consistent. It's just like that.
You got it.
That for every possible sentence, there's either a yes or a no. Okay.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Um, so basically, I want to say that you have all these possible worlds, and I want to say every possible world does have a beginning. So I think that there are good arguments for that. And if that's true, then every single possible world does have an initial maximal state. That initial maximal state is going to consist of its necessary segment and its contingent segment. Are you following so far?
Yes.
Okay. And then the question is, which initial maximal state obtains? And I find this to be an incredible dilemma, because it seems to me that there are many possible initial maximal states. Which one obtains? And so if you don't have a solution, then you run into what I call the modal deadlock problem. And the only solution I can think of is that all of these initial maximal states share their necessary segment, and the necessary segment deadlock resolves it non-deterministically to one of those initial maximal states. Okay, so in other words, this would be an instance of simultaneous causation, but
Wait, so
but go ahead.
wait, yeah. So I mean, I'm not sure if I'm understanding the problem. So I mean, you were asking which of those obtains.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't like, you know, the answer to which obtains is, whichever one is actual. I don't know which one it is, but
Yeah, but I don't. I mean, the question
like,
becomes. Go ahead.
or yeah, sorry, good.
Well, it's just that's not. I mean, I am not up for one of them just brutally being the case. Um,
Oh, okay, yeah.
I'm a
So the thought is
rationalist.
like there has to be some feature in virtue of which it obtains, and
Right.
then what's the feature in virtue? Yeah, I guess I would just reject that there has to be some feature in virtue of which some
So
world is actual.
you'd be fine on your model with, granting that there is necessarily a beginning, just there being um, a contingent, a segment with no explanation.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that really radically violates my intuitions.
Yeah, I mean, this will get into a longer discussion, but I think basically, we'll all have to think that, like, I don't think there's a plausible story to be told about why God would be necessary. Um, and so as a result, I think even if you're a theist, you should have a sort of Swinburne type view according to which God is contingent. Um,
Yeah.
Now I've grown less certain of that in recent weeks because I think the Gödelian ontological argument might work, but um, but
I think that as long as someone can provide an explanation for that initial contingent segment, then they're automatically going to have a superior worldview than you because ultimately things are less surprising for them than they are for you.
I agree that would be true, like all else equal, right? But my claim is just all else will not be equal. I don't think that there is a remotely plausible story about what, like, if you had some plausible picture about why, there would be some necessary grounding of reality. Okay, yeah, that would be better than my story because it has one less brute fact. But I claim there is no such story that's equally plausible. Um,
Well, what's wrong with the story that I just gave, where you do have a necessary segment, and that necessary segment indeterministically resolves to one
in
of the
virtue of what
contingent.
is it necessary?
It's necessary in kind of the classical sense of it's incoherent for it not to be. So when I think of two, the number two, um, it strikes me as the right kind. Like it's not like this physical pink bunny. That's not at all like because the physical pink bunny is like straightforwardly a contingent thing. It can exist or fail to exist. But the number two, there's lots of
Yeah.
arguments
Like
that
I
it's
know
necessary.
I know like the definition of necessary, but uh, like I think generally if something's necessary, there should be either like there are some things where it makes sense for them to just be necessary by themselves. Where
Mhm.
like if you ask, okay, why is it necessary that they can't be married bachelors? Well, because there can't be contradictions. Why can't there be contradictions? That doesn't seem to call out for any further explanation. That seems like the type of thing where it just is necessary.
That's right.
Where that doesn't even seem like a remotely like that doesn't seem like an explanatorily inadequate picture. Where how could there be how even could there be anything in virtue of which the law of non-contradiction obtains? But
Yeah.
but I mean, when I think of some particular contingent being, or sorry, some particular necessary being, it doesn't seem incoherent to imagine it not existing. So
Right.
it seems like there would have to be some feature in virtue of which its non-existence is impossible. And then
Yeah.
I don't
So
know
what
what that feature is supposed to
I
be.
love how the way you're going. I agree with you entirely, and that's what drove me into this model. Is I didn't like the idea of saying that God is necessary and then not being able to see God's necessity. So I don't think that there's like some algorithmic way to determine what is and isn't necessary. I think that we employ our faculty of reason to just apprehend these things that are necessary, and we happen to apprehend that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is necessary. And we happen to apprehend these other necessary truths that are not unified by anything other than our reason, our capacity for reason telling us that they're necessary. So basically, the litmus test is it's a matter of coherence. Um, so like there are things that it just seems like reality would be incoherent if this were not necessary.
Yeah. So
Like,
why would reality be incoherent without God?
okay, so the way I do that is I start with basically I run the modal deadlock reasoning to get to a necessary foundation. I'm not saying it's conscious yet, but I am saying it has a lot of the things that resemble thoughts, namely the Platonic realm and ideas. All that's together. I mean, you have to add in consciousness before it can actually turn into God, but I think you have all that fodder there. And it doesn't have power either. You might think the Platonic realm traditionally doesn't have the power to cause or create anything, right?
Yeah.
So, so I do two things to address both of those issues. First off, I say that forget God, but the necessary segment of reality, it does, believe it or not, have causal power. It is the whatever is that part of that necessary segment is the only thing that can explain why this contingent segment of the contingent beginning segment that obtains, only the necessary segment can explain why that contingent segment obtained. So as long as there's a contingent segment, it's incoherent for I think a brute, it just brutally existing is incoherent. The necessary segment causing it is the only explanation that's available as far as I can tell. Does that make sense? You don't have to agree with it, but does that
Yeah,
reasoning make
yeah,
sense?
yeah, that makes sense. I think Kenneth Pierce has sort of a similar idea where like it's like
Oh,
the beginning thing has to be non-deterministic.
yeah.
Uh and so and then the only thing that could be non-deterministic but causally efficacious is something like a mind with free will. And
Yeah,
so that's
although I'm not going there yet.
okay.
There are people that argue that. I'm actually because I haven't established yet that there's anything that there are minds or anything like that.
Yeah,
Um,
right. Okay, so you established the first thing has to have causal powers in order
yeah,
to
all I know right now that I feel certain of is that there is this necessary segment, and the necessary segment has to explain the contingent segment right at the beginning, and that's how you get your initial maximal state, and that's all I know right now. But that initial that necessary segment, that means it has to have causal power, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Okay. I grant that's coherent. I mean, I object to that on the well, um I agree that if there is a necessary thing that it has to have causal powers, but I don't think that this is an adequate explanatory model of the necessary thing. So there are going to be cases where it's both the case that denying them is absurd, and also you feel like they're unexplained. Where like there's some example. There's some like e to the power of pi to the power of I or something is like -1.
Mhm.
I think I butchered all the numbers, but like
Sure.
something roughly like that. Denying that, it leads to absurdity, leads to denying mathematical results. Nonetheless, that is, at least prior to having some unified explanation of why in the world that obtains, that is deeply mysterious. And so the thought is that in a similar way, even if you have an argument for why, if there is a necessary thing, it has to be um, it has to be, have all these causal powers. I think it's still deeply mysterious why there is a necessary thing with causal powers.
Yeah, and I'm not in the business of trying to um, explain why there's this law of non-contradiction or why the necessary things are true. I don't think we need that. I think that we're doing our due diligence in a rationalistic way, as long as we're not resorting to brute facts, and simultaneously um, we're not accepting incoherencies. So if I'm like the rough principle is if I'm going to say that something's necessary, it shouldn't be random. It should be the kind of thing that my reason tells me is plausibly necessary. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
but I don't think that I think you still will have a brute fact, but it'll be a brute necessity. Where like the positing the law of non-contradiction, that's not a brute necessity. That's not a brute necessity because when you just think, okay, does the law of non-contradiction, does that seem like the type of thing that calls out for an explanation? No, it doesn't. It just
Excellent.
seems fine. But my thought is that
Hold on.
with
Do you
God,
notice you just articulated the very principle that I did just now?
Well, I
If
thought
that's not the kind of
your
thing that
principle,
cries out for an explanation, that's my principle, is basically if you're gonna say something's necessary, it needs to be the kind of thing that seems necessary. That's basically the principle, and you just affirmed it.
yeah, I agree with that. But my claim is I just don't think God is the type of thing that seems necessary.
But I'm not saying that right now. I'm not there
Or
yet.
well, and more broadly, I don't think anything that's causally efficacious is the type of thing that seems necessary.
Okay, but here's where I come to you. Grant me that there are multiple possible beginnings, as defined earlier, initial maximal states. At least one obtains, and at most one obtains. Those are necessary truths. And as long as those are necessary truths, one of them's got to obtain, only one. How do you get to exactly that particular one? And I think you can see, just like you can see the law of non-contradiction and some other necessary truths that may not be as clear, but I think you can see the only way you're going to get that contingent segment is by looking at the necessary. And I think you already believe in a necessary segment, right? Because you believe in in Platonic type stuff, right?
Yeah, but I don't believe in a necessary causally efficacious segment.
That's fine. You're about to discover that it's causally efficacious because we've got an argument, and the argument is that's all that's left to cause the contingent segment.
Yeah, right. So I agree. If you're committed to thinking there that there has to be some feature in virtue of which the possible worlds obtain, but that feature it has to be a necessary feature because you're uncomfortable with which world obtains being a brute fact. Then I
It's
agree.
not
Okay,
just that I'm
then
uncomfortable, it's that the person who has an explanation automatically wins over the person who cites a brute fact.
yeah. But so
And on this model, if you
but so
hold on, if you allow the necessary segment to have causal powers, you don't have to cite any brute facts at all.
well, I think you still do have to cite a brute fact where like you still have to cite a brute necessity where the brute necessity relates to why the necessary thing has causal powers. Um,
Because the alternative is incoherent.
but the alternative being incoherent is not an explanation. So, well, to one, I deny that the alternative is incoherent. I agree the alternative it might have at least one theoretical cost, but just the if the alternative is just you know there's a contingent fact without any deeper explanation. That doesn't seem incoherent. Maybe false, but it doesn't strike me as incoherent. But even if the alternative to some view is incoherent, that is not necessarily an explanation of why it's true. So think back to the math case
Hold
where
on. What about that principle you and I agreed on?
the principle that you and I agreed on was that if something like doesn't seems like when you think about it, it doesn't seem to cry out for explanation. It seems like it could be a necessary thing, or it seems like it is a necessary thing.
It
Then
seems like it is a necessary thing. That's right.
yeah, right. So my claim is we have to distinguish between two different things. One is seeming like something is a necessary thing, or sorry, it shouldn't. I don't think the principle should be stated as seeming like it's a necessary thing, but rather seeming like it is a fully self-explanatory thing, where it doesn't seem to call out for any further explanation. Something can be both necessary and explained by something else. The fact that there can't be married bachelors is necessary, but it's explained by the law of non-contradiction. And so I think yes, if there is a self-explanatory fact, uh, or sorry, I agree. If for any truth, if it seems self-explanatory, then believing that it's necessary is not a cost to your view. But there are going to be some
Mhm.
things where you can have a good reason to think that they're necessary, but the theory is not but that thinking that they're necessary is not by itself fully self-explanatory. So that's like the math case where in the case where you have all these numbers that are useful to mathematics and you take one to the power of the other or something and you get -1, it's still mysterious why that's the case, even though of course it's a necessary fact and denying that will lead to all sorts of absurdities. It seems like there has to be some deeper explanation in virtue of which it obtains.
So
And so
I actually, here's my thought on the -1 case that now I fully understand what you're saying with it, is that if you were more rational, it would seem necessary to you.
um, yeah. Well, so I agree that if you were more rational, it would seem necessary to you. But because you in that case you would understand at a deeper level why it can't be otherwise. But
Mhm.
and so I agree. um, if you could understand at a deep level why, why God is fully self-explanatory, then then positing God as the necessary being, or sorry, not God, sorry.
And I might push back a little bit. I don't even know if you necessarily need to see like, a worked out mathematical example or whatever you would call an explanation. If you were sufficiently rational, I think you could just immediately um, just just recognize its truth.
Um, hmm, I I'm not sure if I agree with that, but even if
It
that's
would be as clear to
true,
you, like you don't have to like. It wouldn't be like you have to derive 2 + 2 = 4. You're just at a point where you can rationally get it immediately. And in the same way, I think you could rationally get the -1 thing if you were sufficiently rational.
yeah. So whether something seems to call out for an explanation will be relative to an agent. So, if you're a god, sort of like, everything seems, nothing seems to call out for an explanation. You have a deep understanding of
Yeah,
all
but I'm
things.
talking about stuff only like derivable and apprehendable by pure reason.
Yeah.
So I'm
Um,
not talking about like, other contingent things that God knows or discerns or whatnot. I'm literally talking about the realm of reason. And I think that
yeah.
when we're trying to
Yeah.
discern what's, go ahead.
I want to grant that if you have like, for any truth, if that truth is in fact necessary, then uh, a ideal reasoner would find it non-mysterious. But
Yeah.
if you, as a non-ideal reasoner, do find it mysterious, then that might give you that does give you some reason to think that an ideal reasoner would find it mysterious, which is some reason to think it's not necessary. And so
Yeah.
in the case of God, when I keep saying God, in the case of some first thing with various causal powers, that to me that doesn't seem fully self-explanatory, and it to me just intuitively it doesn't seem necessary.
Here's the
And so
explanation for me is that I feel like I'm at the point where I've thought about it enough, and I can see why. Because I don't I think that the brute fact model, I think that's incoherent. And if you do think it's incoherent, I think it's an abandonment of reason. Then if you do see its incoherence, you see that there cannot be a reality that does not have a necessary deadlock resolver. It, you can just immediately see it's impossible. And so I don't feel like there's anything left to explain at that point because there's going to be some
um,
reality.
but
And as
yeah,
long as there's some reality, you're going to have a deadlock resolver.
yeah, so I don't think that resolves the mystery. I think that gives you a reason to think that, like, that does give you a reason to think that God is necessary, but it doesn't provide an explanation of why God is necessary. Just like in the
Yeah,
the
but what, not God, but
sorry,
for
I
for
need
the
to stop saying that.
yeah,
Some
for the necessary segment to causally explain the contingent segment. I can see that. I can see that there's got to be a necessary segment and a contingent segment, and the only way for this to happen is for the necessary segment to cause the contingent segment at the initial state.
Yeah.
That's the
So
only
I
way it can
agree.
happen.
Yeah. So I agree that's true if you accept the PSR.
Yep, that's
And
right.
if you deny the possibility of these brute chances. But my thought is that uh, I think, well, it's true that if you have that view, then your view will follow. If your view still seems to leave something explained, namely why that thing is necessary in the first place, then that can give you reason to accept the existence of brute facts. So if
Wait,
you
say that
think,
again.
so if one thinks that your view is not satisfactory because it leaves something calling out for explanation, namely why that causally necessary first thing, or why that necessary first thing has the causal powers that it does, then that could give you a reason to reject the PSR because you just think that the broad worldview on which the PSR is true ends up being implausible. Um,
I feel a little lost there. I mean,
yeah.
at the end of
So
the day, though, I don't feel like there's anything left to explain. But as long as you really believe and apprehend that at least one beginning obtains and at most one beginning obtains, everything falls out of that pretty immediately, including the necessity of the necessary segment having power.
Yeah, my thought is I don't think you should think that. Where so imagine so imagine some non-trivial mathematical fact like that, e to the power of pi to the power of I or whatever is -1. That one in particular is almost certainly false, but something like that, where after just thinking about that principle, um, you should think that there's some deeper explanation of why that obtains. And if you think really hard, like imagine you're not sure if that's the case. You're like 50-50 on whether that's the case. You haven't been able to do the math. And you're like, okay, for that to be the case, there would have to be some deeper principle. And you think really hard about what the deeper principle could be in virtue of which it obtains. And you think, I can't think of any deeper principle that there could be in virtue of which it might obtain. Then that would give you reason to think that to reject the principle, because for that principle to be plausible, it's not plausible just for it to exist, for it to just be a brute necessity. It's only plausible if it falls out of more fundamental stuff. And there is not, and so if you think hard, then you don't come up with any plausible story about how it could fall out of fundamental stuff. You think, okay, you have some reason to think it doesn't fall out of fundamental stuff. And my thought is God is in an analogous position, where if you start out 50-50 about the PSR, and then they say, well, on this view on which there's no PSR, if this view has or on the view on which the PSR is true, it has this explanatory advantage in that it leaves no brute facts. And why does it leave no brute facts? Because it invokes this this causally necessary being that. Sorry, this is a very difficult thought to express.
I know.
Yeah, it invokes this causally necessary being
foundation. Yeah, right.
Yeah, that brings about everything. And then you're like, okay, and why does that being obtain? And the argument is, they say that being obtains because we know that other this is the only story.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that you already believe in a necessary segment. I
believe in a necessary segment of reality, but I don't believe in any
that it has causal powers.
Right. And I don't believe in any things that are necessary that I can't either derive from the necessary things or that strike me as self-explanatory, as fully explanatory, where they don't seem to call out for an explanation. So I believe all sorts of non-trivial mathematical theorems. Well, actually, I don't know if I believe any, because I can't do math. But if some mathematician came up to me and showed me, no, okay, I know the proof there are infinite prime numbers, okay, and I believe that one. Well, actually, no, for that one I know the proof. Okay, I believe Fermat's last theorem, even though I don't know the proof, just because I know that follows from more fundamental mathematical commitments. But my claim is, for any belief you have about the necessary, you should only believe it if or at least not you should only believe it, but it's only like virtuous to believe. There might be other cases where you should believe it if the alternative view is so bad, but you only have a good reason to believe it, either if when you think about it, it seems like the type of thing that's self-explanatory, where you don't think any part of it calls out for an explanation, or that follows from other self-explanatory things. And then my claim is God is neither self-explanatory, or sorry, the causally necessary first thing is neither self-explanatory in the sense where when you think about it, it doesn't seem to call out for explanation, nor does it follow from anything else that's self-explanatory. And so as a result.
Okay, I hear you. Well, so that's something maybe we can explore together later. But yeah, my view, I do see it differently. I do think that as long as you can see those premises I was articulating, there are multiple possible beginnings or possible initial maximal states. Necessarily at least one obtains, and necessarily at most one obtains. I think the longer you reflect on that, the more clear it becomes that reality has to be coherent, and it's not just like an argument. You're actually going to be able to see that any coherent reality has a necessary foundation with causal power. But anyways, I won't push you or whatever. I know you disagree.
Just briefly, so think back to the mathematical case, where in the mathematical case, you can show that if you deny that e pi I or whatever. If you deny that, you'll get mathematical absurdity. But nonetheless, that still does seem to cut for an explanation, because even though you have
Well,
a good
that's because
argument
you don't.
for it,
That's because you're seeing some proof. But if you fully understood the proof, then you would have transcended the need for the proof. Like, and in that case, you would see it. And I'm telling you something. I'm not giving you like some abstract long proof with a conclusion that you can't understand, but you just know that you got there. You can actually see the steps, and you can. It's not a complicated thing. You can see it all together at once, and you can immediately see the need for a necessary cause at the beginning.
okay, so imagine in that case, you give this very simple proof. You had this two-step proof that if you deny this, you get mathematical absurdity. You get you get the result that 1 = 2. I would still think, okay, I now have a good argument for accepting this, and it's not a
Mhm.
complicated argument. It's easy to understand. But this doesn't explain why it is true. It just explains you have an argument against it being false, but you don't have an explanation of why it's true. And my thought is the same about God. But yeah, we've been sort of, we have been hitting on this, point for a bit. Um, it's funny, we have talked very little about the resurrection.
Yeah, well, ultimately, what I was, the next step of what I was going to talk about, though, is I do think that there's a reason, when you start to think about what the foundation would resolve to, if you use the standard analysis of counterfactuals, like what would obtain, you're going to ultimately get out this thing that you're going to the most similar state that the whatever's most similar to the necessary state. I don't want to get into that. It's a long discussion. There are points to disagree with, but anyways, that's where I ultimately get to. And then I like talk about why I think this thing, like it's all naturalistic at this point. But I think that, when it comes to like the endeavor of determining resemblance and given the network, I think you can have something like supervenient consciousness for that foundation. And then that's my model of, my toy model of God. So it's the deadlock resolver model. But why am I bringing that up? Well, it comes back to me saying that in fact, when you see things that make reality less like the foundation, it's going to be things that violate the what I would call the foundation's intention. So um, so there are going to be a set of possible beginnings and worlds that are among those that are unsurpassably resembling the that foundation. One of those obtains. It has a reason for obtaining the one that does, and one of the reasons is it's one of the few that meet this criterion. That's why it obtains. Indeterministically. So there's a reason for it, and there's a reason why you exist, because you contribute to making the world more resembling more resemblant of the foundation. And anything that sort of violates that purpose is what I would call evil, and that's the thing that's ultimately going to be destroyed, annihilated. There won't be a world on my model if all of this works. There won't be a world where it's okay to just like be doing things that either kill people, destroy people, um, randomly because they're resemblers, or make them less resemblant of that foundation by taking away their power and knowledge and so forth. Those sorts of things are always going to be disresemblance makers. So I want to kind of explain morality that sort of way,
Yeah,
to answer your question. Now, maybe it works. That's a long,
yeah. I
thing
mean,
in its own right.
my view is so I think I have a much better story where you think about the moral facts and you think, okay,
Uh-huh.
uh, things like the goodness of love, the badness of suffering, these seem necessary. So they don't seem to call out for
Mm.
explanation. And then you ask, okay, why does God have all the attributes he does? Because they're good. The goodness is not grounded in God. The godness is grounded in the good.
See, that's
And so,
funny. I actually would use your exact illustration, but with numbers before about goodness. I can like I think that I can like see arguments, and I can see like they do seem in a sense necessary, but their necessity cries out for an explanation in my
oh,
mind.
I don't have that intuition at all. I sort of, I just you sort of think about why is it bad when people are in pain? I, there isn't a further reason other than that's what pain's like.
Yeah. Yeah, or
Pain is the type of thing that
why
gives
is
you.
love good? Why is beauty good? Why is pleasure good? Those
Yeah.
things, yeah,
Why deny beauty is good,
I want a
at
unifying
least
explanation.
non-instrumentally.
What's that?
Yeah. I deny that beauty is good non-instrumentally, but
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, so I do kind of want a unifying explanation. That's actually part of what I think is a benefit of the model I have is because I think it can reduce those things and I can kind of see another way of recognizing them. I can
yeah. I mean,
derive them.
I'm skeptical that you're going to be able to have a story that explains why each of these particular things are like what are valuable.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I can
yeah,
Okay, then
that's
let's go back to the resurrection at this point. Uh let's see if we can do this.
yeah,
So um in terms of the business of intervening, like would God do that kind of thing? What my model is suggesting is ultimately that God's going to be doing things um that are tailored to whatever he decided. So I mentioned that sort of torn decision that God makes in that, on my model. I was kind of pressing you about that. Is if God couldn't, being perfect, cannot desire to destroy evil right now, immediately, any more than he does at this moment. And simultaneously, God has an unsurpassable desire to save and lavish mercies and preserve us as resemblers and work on making us more and more resemblant. If you have those two competing desires, God has a whole range of options, whether it's complete annihilation of everything or whether it's complete mercy and trying to build up everything, or starting all over again, whatever. All of that is compatible with a perfect God in terms of how I'm thinking about it. But I think that it's very plausible that God did pick a sort of middle ground, and I think that's what we're observing, where God is not like going gung ho to uh, make sure everything, all agents come into relationship, but at the same time, God has put in done a lot of work in that regard, and some of that work involves giving these signs for us that there is a way to be preserved. The righteous, the resemblers, will be preserved, and Jesus rising from the dead is the foremost proof of this. Why? Jesus was sinless. Jesus is the ultimate resembler of God. That's why when Jesus dies, it's natural for Jesus to rise again. And that's the state that we're going to be in. Once evil is destroyed, we're going to be, I think we're going to return to a state where if something happens to us, we'll just resurrect again. And notice that this ties into that question of would God plausibly raise Jesus from the dead? That was the big question before. Now we have a story for why God would plausibly raise Jesus. It's not some random miracle. It's directly connected to the purpose of God making the world to resemble him. Where if God just did some other random miracle, it wouldn't help the resemblance of the world. It's through raising Jesus that resemblance is reintroduced. And it will be the same for us as well, if we get on board with the plan, because God's going to be spring cleaning on this model, destroying evil, and that's going to be when we reach a particularly high resemblance state. What do you think? I mean, do you see the coherence of that model at least?
yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's coherent, but I think it'll have problems. One of the problems is, well, for the reason I described before, it seems like there are a lot of things God could do to intervene in the world to like reduce the amount of evil in the world,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and to that therefore increase people's resemblance to God. So like over time, arguably, we've gotten less evil. Um, there are all sorts of conditions in the physical world that make people more likely to be evil.
Mm-hmm.
Like for instance, if there's lead in people's water, they're more likely to be violent.
Okay.
He could intervene to prevent all those things. Um, there just seem like all sorts of interventions that if God were trying to minimize the evil in the world, we're trying to expunge as much of it as quickly as possible without killing people, that he would intervene to bring about.
But what if it's more important for God? Because yeah, I mean, stopping a little bit of evil from lead poisoning and people being more violent, I mean, that's small potatoes compared to the, um, if God is going to perform a miracle that's going to secure a free agent for eternity, right?
Um, well, but I mean, this might also secure a free agent for eternity, where, there are lots of things ways God could intervene in the world to increase the number of Christians and to increase the probability of people being saved for eternity. For instance, suppose that, the sky began to spell out Christ is king. And it just
Mhm.
said that, scientists investigate, they couldn't find any naturalistic explanation of that. It's just blinding white light. The number of Christians would increase. Um,
So
uh,
here, that's when I start to get into this question of, why. So I mean, because it's when you say Christians would increase, maybe people would start to believe in God, but is it true that people would truly want to freely submit to Him? I don't know about that. What
um,
if what if I mean, I could imagine. I mean, because that doesn't say anything about like the moral properties of God or anything like that. And maybe the people who do come to believe in God, maybe they'll just do whatever they have to do, out of fear or something. And it's not actually motivated by a true love of God and a
okay,
true
sure.
desire to give in to Him.
And why does making like uh, why does making it so that the evidence for Jesus's being king be this sort of like shoddy historical evidence where you do inference to the best explanation on it in order to come up to the conclusion that he is God? How is that different from the sign in the sky? Um, in terms of whether it would increase the number of people who like are willing to freely submit to him.
I don't think that God is like super preoccupied with convincing everybody that Jesus rose from the dead. Because as you say, if he were really preoccupied with that, everybody would believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So I don't think that that's like some super. And again, that ties into what I said before. I don't know that God is like um, like gung ho about a bunch of people about getting everybody to freely choose him, because again, God wants to destroy them at the same time. I really believe that about God. I think that God has that love of them, but simultaneously, if we fail to see the other side of God, of truly, it is impossible to hate wickedness and evil more than God does, then we're missing out on it. So again, on my model, God's chosen a middle ground where it's like, hey, either way, things are gonna work out the way that I want them to. Whether
Yeah.
everybody's destroyed and nobody hears about Jesus, maybe Jesus did die for sins and whatnot, but nobody hears about it. I'm okay with that because justice is coming, destruction of evil is coming, and that's good. Maybe even sooner. Um, and on the other hand, if God saves everybody and ensures everybody knows, I think there are a lot of complications with
So
getting people's
do you
heart in the
think
right place. Oh,
do you
sorry, go
think that
ahead.
do you think a person can be saved if they are not a Christian in this life?
Yes, I think that's possible. Um, I think that what you have to believe is that I think you do have to recognize that God exists. I think you do have to recognize that evil exists. But I think what you have to do ultimately is recognize that in God's goodness and in your failure to meet those good standards,
Okay,
and there you
so
go. Hold on. In failure to meet those standards, you believe that God has provided some way. Like you ask God for forgiveness and believe that God has made some provision for you. And I think God will respect that.
okay, so you think the atheists are screwed?
Yeah, if they don't believe that, that's right.
Yeah.
And
Um,
when we say screwed, I think that they're going to be annihilated. That's all. Now, I actually do believe in just desserts, so I think there can be like a time of just punishment, but that's not essential, and you can reject that. What's relevant right now is that there will be a spring cleaning of reality.
yeah. Well, so I don't find it at all plausible that God would be indifferent between bad people being destroyed and them becoming perfectly good, where like he doesn't it's like he doesn't really care about the number of people who believe in God in this life. What he cares about is he sort of he has this middle ground where some people who believe in God and some people who accept this are able to accept him and others aren't, because I think it's true that a good person will want to see badness destroyed, but it's much better for badness to be reformed and to be turned into goodness than for it to
Yeah,
be
but
destroyed.
reformation takes a lot of time, and sometimes it is impossible. But the time it takes means that, that's conflicting with the impatience part, because if you truly hate evil, you don't just want it destroyed, you want it destroyed now, immediately. And you could not want it to be destroyed immediately more than you already do if it's unsurpassable.
This just doesn't seem like a fitting desire, where like you see someone, mostly a pretty good guy that has certain bad character traits, as we all do, and your desire is you want to see that person destroyed, all things considered, because you're so impatient with their direction of evil. That doesn't seem like the desires of a perfect God. That seems sort of pathological.
I do disagree with that, because if you think, because if for the person that you're thinking about right now, who's contemplating another individual and their wickedness, if this person is, if sorry, you're not seeing both of my hands, if this person is not at a state at wanting them immediately destroyed in the midst of their wickedness, then it's possible for them to desire the destruction of evil more than they already do. But that contradicts the very definition of someone who unsurpassably hates evil and wants it destroyed.
I don't think it does. Like, uh, I think the amount that you should want evil destroyed is proportional to how great the evil is. So if a person had an infinitely strong, like,
Not an infinite. No, see, you're not thinking about infinite. You're not really thinking of the very fact that you're talking about proportions here means you're not thinking about unsurpassable yet. Because
but I don't think unsurpassable greatness of the being means unsurpassable hatred of evil. Where
okay, well then we can get to that. But right now, and I'll defend that in a moment. But if we do grant that someone unsurpassably hates evil, wants it destroyed, then whether it's someone that just has a little evil or a lot of evil, in both cases, immediately you could not unsurpassably want either one of them destroyed more than you already do. That's just the nature of unsurpassable. So the
okay,
degrees
well,
don't matter.
okay, I think if you have an unsurpassable, like, even if your desire is infinite for evil to be destroyed, some infinites are bigger than others, and there are going to be lots of cases where we have to compare infinites. I think any plausible view is going to have to say that,
No, no, I'm talking about like cardinality sense of infinite. So no, there's no there. It's on the same scale. It's
yeah,
there's
right. Right. So maybe it would be the same cardinality, but there are infinites of the same cardinality where we're still going to want to say in an intuitive sense that one is bigger than the other, especially if one is, for instance, like a subset of the other. Um, and
well,
so my
then it's surpassable. You're building into it surpassability.
um uh Yeah. Okay. So then I guess my hangup would be with the claim that God has an unsurpassable hatred of evil and unsurpassably wants it to be gone. Because my thought is, God's desire for the conjunction of all good things in the world to happen should be much stronger than his desire for evil to stop existing. But if it were really
What if the desire is for a perfect world?
I think his desire for a perfect world should be greater than his desire for um, eliminating any particular evil. But if you think that his desire for evil to abate is unsurpassable, then that could not happen by definition.
I lost a little bit there, but if it seems to me that it's going to be two pronged, is and here is like, you should know that there's a lot of, like, this is not something that can just be quickly dismissed, that God has an unsurpassable desire to immediately destroy and get rid of evil. That is very intuitively something I think that would be associated with a perfect God, it's compatible with God also desiring the kind of thing that you're talking about, which is to redeem and help the good things that there are flourish and
Okay.
remove their evil in a more natural way. And that's what we're talking about, though. That does require patience. It requires work, and sometimes it doesn't work. And if God's and if open theism is true, which I'm very open to, God may not even know if or when such a person will reach such a state. Um, so it's not clear to me that God would just obviously do the redemption path for everybody at all. It's not clear to me if God is
Yeah.
perfect, if God is unsurpassably, if God is like the greatest possible being.
Okay, so do you agree that if one's desire for something to obtain is unsurpassable, then there's no possible desire that's stronger than it?
Yeah, I think that's I haven't thought about it in those terms, because now I'm thinking like ways you might be able to generate a paradox out of that. So I don't know. I don't know if I can affirm exactly that, but something like that.
Wait, what's the way you can generate a paradox out of that?
Well, I'm trying to think like if God unsurpassably desires to destroy evil, what if there's like some subset? Well, we're flipping around. Our images are
Oh,
flipping.
sorry, I didn't realize that showed up on other screens. Yeah, I just whoops.
Like freaking me out here. I'm okay. um,
Yeah, I like fidget a lot, you know.
oh, you're fine. Um, I'm just wondering if you could generate a paradox by saying, well, then God unsurpassably desires to destroy or, prevent lying. And then God unsurpassably desires to do this other thing. And then maybe you could generate a contradiction in there. I don't know how you do it,
Yeah,
but
yeah. I mean, because I think, for your argument to work, you have to think, he has this unsurpassable desire such that there's no possible desire he could have that could be stronger than it. And my thought is, I don't think you should think his desires are like this. So here's one case that I think trivially bears that out.
Mhm.
God's desire for, okay, which is stronger? God's desire for me not to lie later today, or for both me not to lie and Adolf Hitler not to carry out the Holocaust? I think his desire for both of those things not to obtain should be stronger than his desire for just me not to lie.
Yeah, I don't, but the very nature of unsurpassable means no, they're both the same. It's both
Which is, I
maximal.
think, a reason why a perfect being would not have an unsurpassable desire for evil not to obtain.
Yeah, so you think that that's
It could be
problematic?
surpassed by his desire for greater evils not to obtain, or it could be surpassed by his desire for great goods to obtain, I think.
Say that again?
I think you should think that a perfect being does not have an unsurpassable desire for evils not to obtain. It has a very great desire for evils not to obtain, but that desire could be surpassed by its desire for even greater evils not to obtain, and its desire could be surpassed by very great goods obtaining.
How do we get those limits though? Where do those limits come from?
What do you mean?
Well, because then you're starting to make things degreed, and that starts to make it sound awfully contingent, like the degree to which maybe there's a way to do it,
I
but
don't think degree. I think. Or sorry, good.
my I was gonna say my default would be kind of what I was saying at the very beginning, where someone doing a little evil and someone doing a lot of evil, both of those are unsurpassable. God wants to destroy both unsurpassably. Um, so that's the end of it. There's nothing else to say at that point.
I totally reject this. Where I think you should think that it is surpassable by certain other desires. I don't understand why this requires contingency. Where thinking that things come in degrees doesn't mean that they're contingent. Numbers come in degrees. Wrongness comes in degrees. None of these things are contingent.
Yeah,
And it seems almost analytic to think that if you don't desire A and you don't desire B, then and you don't desire them even in combination with the other one, then your desire for not A and not B will be greater than your desire for just not A or not B. But you
yeah,
have to deny that, because you have to think that God's desire for one person not to commit a slight wrongdoing is just as great as his desire for Hitler not to carry out the Holocaust and that person not to carry out a wrongdoing. Even though one wrongdoing is a proper subset of the other and contains a much greater wrongdoing.
Yeah, I feel that for sure. And I do want to, on the one hand, I do definitely want to acknowledge that there are some evils are greater than others. And like on my model too, I want that desire to be like connected with God's desire. So that could be like a tension in my model where on the one hand, I am saying that God, these some of these desires are degreed and weighed, and on the other hand, I'm over here affirming my more theological conclusion from another direction that it's unsurpassable. Um, so yeah, I might need to think about that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the basic principle is just like it sounds good to say that God's desires for the abolition of evil are unsurpassably great. Uh but I think that like you should think God's attitudes are fitting. He has the best set of attitudes that a being could have. And if a being has fitting attitudes, then their desire for the destruction of certain very minor evils will be much less great than their desire for the destruction of much greater evils, and it will be much less great than their desire for the creation of great goods. And so
mhm.
that just straightforwardly entails that God's desires for abating small evils are not unsurpassable. They're in fact
Yeah.
quite surpassable by other
Let
divine
me
desires.
let me tease this out though, because I wonder if there could be. Yeah, this is like a new area of my thinking. So I'm gonna explore a little bit with you here, but I wonder if the general principle can be preserved though, that as long as you're increasing the desire to destroy evil enough, as a whole, like let's say, take all the things that are evil, line them up, from least to greatest. That you could still imagine that whole scale going down together or going up together based on how strongly God desires it. Does that make sense? So, in other words, you can imagine God looking at a little evil and kind of not liking it, and then kind of not liking more the next greater evil. Or you can start right from the beginning and say God super duper hates that little evil. He just super duper duper hates the next evil a little more. So the scale itself is rising and lowering. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Um, yeah. So like God really hates all evils, but he hates some more than others.
Yeah, and the way to resolve your issue potentially, if I'm thinking about this correctly, is just to say, "Hey, Matthew, it sounds like you're acknowledging that God hates evil, but I don't think you've grasped fully how much God hates evil. Maybe it's
Yeah.
not unsurpassable, like I was saying. Maybe the only unsurpassable one is the greatest evil or some such, if there is such a thing. But regardless, the
Yeah.
point
But I
is if I raise that scale enough, if I say God hates evil enough, it will and can reach a point that, because you're gonna have to say the same thing about love, right? About loving the good and loving people. No longer are we going to say that's unsurpassable, because you can always talk. You can run the same sort of thought experiments that you did with the A versus A and B thing.
yeah,
Um,
I think the problem is that once you allow God to hate some evils more than others, then you should allow God's desires for some goods to obtain to be greater than his desire for some evils not to obtain. Okay,
mhm,
so if you agree, God's desires for the Holocaust not to obtain, that God's desires for a person not to tell a lie are very great, but they're dramatically surpassed by his desires for I don't know, for the Holocaust not to obtain, then you would think that God also his desires for bad not to obtain are can be surpassed by his desires for great goods to obtain, and
that's
then
right.
he would be willing to keep people around to bring about great goods. Well, how
Yeah,
goods are great? Well, the thought is and one of the motivations here is that God has to have fitting attitudes. So for any
yeah,
state of affairs, if the state of affairs being added to the world is a fortunate thing, then God would have a desire for that state of affairs to exist. While if it's an unfortunate thing, he would have a desire for it not to exist. And then thought is, then at that point, uh, his hate, how much he hates evil, isn't doing any work, because as much as he hates evil, he loves greater goods more than that. And so then he would be willing, he wouldn't annihilate people as long as sustaining them in existence produced greater value, which it would if you think just based on
if
consulting our ordinary intuitions. Like, if we just think about like, okay, which is a better state of affairs? No one exists, or people exist and they're sort of mostly pretty good, but they have some evil in them. The way is true of typical humans. I think most people's normal intuitions and the intuitions of nearly every non-Christian uh, who is not having their intuitions warped by their theory will say that the state of affairs in which people are around and living these happy lives is much better than the state of affairs in which uh, in which uh, people get annihilated.
Yeah. Let me say a couple things. Number one, like this sounds like really helpful. Like this represents what could very well. I'll have to think about it more. Like what represents like a nice development in my model, because I hadn't quite noticed how those two directions of my model and my theology like intersect here, and you helped bring that out. So like thank you for that. That's awesome. Already makes this like a richly rewarding little conversation. That's what I love about these. Um, but now that I'm working this through, what I'm suggesting, like as a new route here, like this slight modification to help resolve that issue, is to nevertheless raise the whole scale enough so that it puts God in a torn decision situation. Okay. And that may conflict with um, your intuitions, because right now you were just saying it just seems like saving the humans here versus destroying them is a better thing to do. But that's like part of me wants to say, you know what, we're a lot more indifferent to sin, I think, than God is. In terms of God's holiness, I think God is more in his purity. I think God is more shocked and repulsed by evil than we are. And if it's enough, maybe you're more callous to evil, being around it, being like kind of moving within it, kind of like Bane. I was born in the darkness. I, it's it's kind of like that. I think God is more offended by it. And if you balance it right, if how I'm thinking about it is right, that God hates it enough, then it might not be so mysterious that God is so desiring to immediately destroy evil more than you would. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but
And
I
it doesn't
think
have to be unsurpassable at this point.
Yeah, but I think there you have the problem where the your view made sense if you apply it to, if you think, yeah, his hatred of evil is unsurpassable, then you can get this sort of incommensurability result where you're like, bringing about great goods is incommensurable with bringing about great evils because they're both unsurpassable, and so it's sort of up to God because it's an incommensurable desires. But that doesn't work for the reasons described before. But now you're just saying, well, God really, really hates evil. And so he would want to get rid of evil, and he wants to get rid of evil, an infinite number of times more than I want to get rid of evil because, I suck in comparison. But his desire for good also is 0% of my desire for good.
Mhm.
And so unless you have this notion of unsurpassability to bring about incommensurability, then I think your view just requires this root intuition that it's better to destroy evil people than to either keep them around so that you can reform them, or if you think that's impossible, just sustain them in existence and give them a good life. And I think, that's just an intuition that very few people have, where if you just think about it, like it seems much better for like a state of affairs where no one exists seems much worse than a state of affairs where lots of people exist despite being somewhat sinful. And so
Yeah,
if that
and
if
that's
that's
why I'm
true,
saying that our intuitions, see, I don't first off, I don't know, what everybody's intuitions is. I suspect as you go around different parts of the world and talk to different types of people, it'll be a little bit different. More secular-minded folk probably will be a lot more interested in preserving humanity, whereas people who are more used to kind of, or, Jewish culture and God and thinking in these sorts of terms, are actually going to be a lot more open to thinking that, hey, if all of humanity was destroyed, this would represent, a sort of an improvement on reality. Um, Not that we'd have the right to do it ourselves. That's why you wouldn't go around killing people. But in terms of the world being a more perfect and good place, if evil is bad enough, then then it can theoretically outweigh the goodness of people
but
being
but
there.
I
That's a perspective, and it's very hard to argue against this, I would say, other than, oh, that's just not how it feels to me. But your feelings can be different from God's feelings. That's what I want to focus on.
yeah, but so I agree. If the point is you just have the intuition that, or at least you think it's plausible that annihilating those who are kind of wicked is better than um, is better than keeping them around living a good life as long as they remain wicked.
Or remember, when I'm not saying better, but or on par with, like, God could go either way.
Yeah, but yeah. So I think that view is coherent, but I don't think it's very plausible. Just because I think it's just, like, when I consider the proposition, it seems obviously false. And I think there are going to be lots of
Mhm.
cases where, like, other people who, you know, even when Christians think about this proposition, when they're not thinking about it when distorted through a Christian lens, they'll also find this unintuitive. So, for instance, consider some work of fiction where there is no God, where it's stipulated that there is no God. So, like, I don't know, like the Percy Jackson series or something. Like,
Mhm.
there are gods lowercase, but there's no God uh, for people to enter into communion with. I think most of us still think, yeah, it's bad in that world when people die. When you read the stories, you read about people dying, you think, okay, that seems like a tragedy. And yet, on this view, it wouldn't be a tragedy because in that world, they're really getting what they deserve. And I think that's a very revisionist view. But my broader point is just, yes, you can have that intuition, you can have that view, perfectly coherent. But I don't think you can support it by just saying, "Oh, look how much God hates sin,"
Yeah.
because it's not merely that God hates sin. Uh, I worry that you're only considering the strength of his emotions in one direction, where
Well, let me give you a
it can't.
quick thought before you go too deep. Well, actually, I'll let you finish. I don't wanna,
Oh yeah,
but
it
I
can't
do have a
be.
thought
Yeah,
exactly on this
yeah.
before
I
you
mean,
go
just the
too
basic
far.
point is it can't just be God hates sin a lot,
Yeah.
uh, because so too does God love the good a lot. And so I think for God's desires to be responsive to reasons, if the good is greater than the bad, then his desire for the good to obtain has to outweigh his desire for the bad not to obtain.
Got
Yeah,
it.
sorry. Go ahead.
Well,
And by
here
the way,
here
I should get
here
going
here
kind of
go ahead.
soon because it's just getting kind of late. But
Yeah.
I'd be happy to talk again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll throw this thought, and then we can start to wrap it up. I hear your intuition, and I'm not saying that it's I think it's an especially common intuition in the West today. But I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that people have had different intuitions about this sort of thing throughout time and place. And for example, whatever Jews or Hebrews were responsible for thinking about the flood story, they were obviously of the persuasion that their perfect good God would just wipe out all of humanity because it was a greater good, and that he preserved Noah in this story, the righteous. So their intuitions conflicted with yours and a lot of your colleagues, and that sort of thinking, should, and it doesn't stop there. Jews, obviously, the very idea of the destruction of the wicked throughout the biblical text, these were, I mean, even on a secular view, the humans involved in making this story were real people, and that was their intuition about evil and the relative value of people, being preserved, regardless of their sin. So I think we need to come at it with an awareness of where we are located in our time and place and the influences on our intuitions that exist, and recognize that ours might be wrong. Maybe their intuitions are more aligned with how reality actually is. And that gives us that sort of epistemic humility I think that we need. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like, I'm kind of inclined to just not trust their intuitions very much. I think our intuitions have gotten a lot better over time. Like, just think about our intuitions uh like, for much of human history, people have had intuitions that were, like, fine with slavery and the subjugation of women in all sorts of ways. That I don't take particularly seriously. Where, like, I don't even have like a 5% credence in them having been right that, like, beating slaves was okay. I have a nearly 0% credence uh, in that. Because I think there are some cases like this where, like, you're really confident in your ethical convictions, and if confused desert people disagreed with them, then they were wrong. And that's
Mm.
sort of how I feel about here. Like, I'm very confident in the judgment, and in particular,
But there are no
like,
there are no real I don't know if there are any, like, I don't know how you approach this, as as someone who doesn't, like, believe in, I don't know where you're get where like where this confidence in your intuitions comes from, because there aren't like scientifically observed facts that help do this. If you sat there and you argued with a Jew from back in the day, or honestly, a lot of Jews today, and a lot of Christians today, a lot of people today, who share that, who you can say they preserve the intuition, but I think they actually have the intuition. Um, I don't know what you're going to say to them, or why you would put so much more confidence in your intuition over there. I mean, I'm hearing you say you have it, but I would really like urge epistemic humility here, when you know that there's a lot of rational people that have a different feeling about something that isn't scientifically confirmable here. You know that there's a lot of rational people that disagree, right?
I mean, for this one, yeah. Well, so I would grant that there are lots of rational people who disagree, but like, I don't know, like, there are some, pretty smart and rational type A physicalists who are like, have thought about this more than I have. I still think I'm reasonable in giving very low credence to type A physicalism. Saying, like, I don't know, I think, sometimes it's rationally justified to just dig your heels in and say, I think I'm right, and I'm
Yeah,
very
yeah. Oh,
confident.
I'm not saying. Well,
And I feel roughly as confident in the falsity of this judgment as I do in the moral belief that you appeal to, as in the falsity of type A physicalism.
remind me, what's type A physicalism?
Oh, it's the one where it says like, there isn't even like a conceptual gap between consciousness and the physical, where zombies aren't even conceivable, and sort of,
Oh yeah,
when just enough thinking about it will reveal that pain is just some dispositional behavior rather than just being some intrinsic quality.
yeah. Well, then as my final word, then I would just say, like, this is like pretty foundational stuff. And I don't know how foundational the physical thing is, because I think a lot of people are like hardcore physicalists, are like they have these other arguments and motivations for going that direction, and even to the point of denying intuitions. Here we're going right to the bottom of intuitions and acknowledging the different intuitions that people have. And I mean, I get the kind of digging your heels. Like, I might dig my heels against someone who doesn't have an intuition of the law of non-contradiction. But I don't
I
know.
mean,
I think,
like 20 something percent of philosophers reject it or something like.
yeah. Oh, you're saying they actually do? 20% do?
I can find the numbers, but I
Well, that's
think it's like
wild.
20%.
Yeah, that's
Um,
wild.
uh,
But then that for me, I don't know if that's has to do with their intuitions, or it has to do with like particular arguments that they might think are persuasive. Here I'm actually saying there aren't really any arguments that can help impinge on this
yeah,
question
it's
if you
like
don't believe in rebel.
it's like
Well, if you
17.
don't, okay. Yeah, and I would suspect that that's not like their intuition that they started with. I suspect that they were reasoned into it. And the difference then in this case is that we're not reasoned into a different view of the value of humans relative to the disvalue of evil. That's not something we're reasoned into. We just find ourselves. And there's a wide gradient, a wide difference among people now and throughout history in terms of what that looks like. So
Yep.
that's all the last thing I have to say there. You can have the final
Yeah,
word on it.
yeah. I mean, I guess just briefly, I mean, there are cases where I think disagreements just come down to intuitions, where I think
Mhm.
it's reasonable to just dig in your heels and be very confident that you're right. Like, there aren't that many of these, but there are some average utilitarians where they think basically you should maximize average utility, which implies that if there are like lots of really miserable people, you should like create lots of really miserable people as long as they're slightly less miserable than the existing person. I think even if there were a lot of these guys, I'd still be justified in digging in my heels and saying the odds they're right is rounds down to zero. Um,
Okay.
and where like, and it's true that a lot of these will come down to one's evaluation of the intuitions rather than having the intuitions themselves. But I think you get the same problem of like, why are you so confident that your evaluation is right and theirs are wrong? Um,
Yeah.
I just think if you're gonna, lots of smart people believe nutty things. Sometimes you just dig in your heels. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, dude, this has been really good in terms of productive conversations. I came out with like a real gem, I feel like, of this conversation. And at the end of our conversation here, like we were actually able to like get down to like a core difference of intuition, which people don't always achieve in their conversations. So
yeah, I
this was
agree. I
really
thought,
this was a really good conversation.
yeah, I agree. I thought it was a lot of fun. Yeah, thanks for coming on. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks for watching, everyone. All right, I guess I'll end the stream.